The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Mueller Madness rears its head again. Democrats attack the president, of course, but do they have the stomach for impeachment? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Former special counsel Robert Mueller breaks his silence, contradicts Attorney General William Barr on obstruction of justice, and then cuts and runs. We'll analyze how much his remarks have changed the political landscape, if at all, and whether the Democrats have the votes needed for impeachment. You'll be shocked at the answer. Plus, in this unprecedented political environment where the two sides can barely talk to each other, we'll introduce you to an actual, legitimate, truly bipartisan coalition for lowering energy prices, and a couple of significant rulings by the nation's highest court.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. Joe Biden continues on a hot roll atop the crowded Democratic field of presidential candidates hoping to unseat President Trump, expanding his already huge lead over runner-up Bernie Sanders to almost 20 points. Is it because he's such an appealing candidate, or because the other 23 candidates are so unappealing? Well, Mark Leibovich, prolific author and national correspondent for the New York Times Sunday magazine and a guest on this show in the past, went on MSNBC and said, polls aside, Biden's campaign is hardly some kind of juggernaut.
Yes, he's a known entity. Yes, he is the Joe Biden that everyone has seen for decades on the national stage. But as a presidential candidate, he's been a monumental failure. I mean, he has run extremely unsuccessfully twice in 1987, didn't even make it to 1988, and in 2008. I was in New Hampshire a few weeks ago. He didn't do a town meeting per se, but he did do one event at a pizza place where he took questions, and there was also a house party where he took questions. He had looked out of practice. I talked to a lot of voters afterwards. He rambled quite a bit. He went from here to here to here. The notion that Joe Biden is a safe pick for Democrats goes to the assumption that this is going to come down to the lesser of two septuagenarian, undisciplined people you know.
Yes, people know Joe Biden as they do Donald Trump, but Biden has a heavy lift ahead with leftist Democrats like these two activists who spoke after a Biden campaign event in Texas.
I don't think you beat something so far right with something so middle ground. Joe Biden is very middle ground for me, and I think you need something a little more far left to combat that.
Yeah, he's Uncle Joe. Everybody likes their fluffy uncle. But he's Barack Obama's friend. He's got the cool black friend, right? That's all it is. Joe has a terrible history in the black community, and everybody just loves him because he's a fluffy old guy. He has given us no policies, and I like Joe Biden, but he's just not.
Like it.
I do like Joe Biden as a vice president.
Biden's chief competitor, Bernie Sanders, was on the stump this week talking about his Medicare for All plan that would amount to a government takeover of health care. And he refused to divulge how he'd pay for the plan, which would supposedly cost $3.5 trillion, but as with most government programs, likely a whole lot more than that. But he was also forced to admit it would involve, surprise, surprise, raising taxes.
What we have chosen not to do, because it would just engender enormous debate, is to tell you how I'm going to raise every nickel in a $3.5 trillion budget. That's something that is going to have to be discussed. So I wanted to lay out the program as to what it would mean and to tell you that it will cost you and ordinary Americans a lot less than you are currently spending on average. Okay, what it will probably end up looking like is a payroll tax on employers, an increase in income tax in a progressive way for ordinary people with a significant deductible for low-income people who pay nothing for it.
Right. Just like Obamacare, which was sold as a plan that would save the average American family some $2,500 a year, but did the exact opposite. But of course, there's something else on the mind of Bernie bros and other left-wing Democrats. They are desperate to impeach the president. A lot of talk about impeachment after the Mueller report, but no action on it. We'll talk more about that a little later on. But the congressman who's brought forward articles of impeachment, the Pied Piper of impeachment, Al Green of Texas, says, forget the Mueller report. Trump should be impeached for the high crime of being a racist.
We have a president who has infused bigotry into policy. When he was contemplating his immigration policy, he made the S-hole countries remark. He went on to talk of policy that would eliminate diversity visas. These are the visas that many persons in Africa have benefited from. He has a policy still currently that is not reuniting families after having separated them at the border. It hurts my heart when I see that picture of that baby crying, being separated from her parents.
The implication, of course, is that he, Congressman Green, and his fellow Democrats are wonderful, compassionate people who want open borders to let anyone into the country who wants in, while Trump is a mean-spirited bigot who should be kicked out of office because he's a mean-spirited bigot. And that's the same accusation thrown at Nigel Farage, leader of the Brexit movement in England, who formed the new Brexit Party just before this last week's European Parliament elections and swept to victory. He went on Fox News and said he had just gotten fed up watching the British political establishment drag its feet and refused to close the deal on what voters approved 3 years ago.
I watched all of this as being one of the architects of the original Brexit referendum and vote, and I thought, I can't stand aside. I can't bear the fact we're having to send members of the European Parliament back to Brussels. So I founded the Brexit Party, and would you believe, within 6 weeks of a brand new party being set up, we topped the polls, we smashed the Conservative Party, we smashed the Labour Party.
But that was just in the EU Parliament elections, and Farage issued a threat or a promise regarding Britain's next national election.
And what the European Union does, it crushes democracy, it takes decision-making powers away from ordinary people and gives it to unelected bureaucrats. But you know, the people I blame aren't necessarily the Brussels bureaucrats. The people I blame are British politicians in Westminster who have not had the courage to take back the independence, sovereignty, democracy of our country. Last week, I've given them the biggest seismic shock that has been seen in modern British politics. And I'll make you this one promise. If we do not leave the European Union on October the 31st, I will lead the Brexit Party after that into the next general election, and we will sweep away parties that have dominated British politics for over 100 years.
With both the Conservative and Labour parties wildly unpopular across England these days, that threat or promise by Farage is something the political establishment is or should be taking very seriously. Finally, John McCain was back in the news again this week, 10 months after his death. It seems Trump administration officials ordered that the name of the ship, the USS McCain, which was actually named for McCain's father and grandfather, be covered during the president's visit to Japan. And McCain's perpetually offended daughter, Meghan McCain, co-host of The View, who actually attacked the President of the United States during her eulogy at her father's funeral, unleashed another broadside at Trump in a response that was all about her.
There's a lot of criticism towards me in the media across the board of how often I speak of my father, how I grieve, how I do it publicly. But it's impossible to go through the grief process when my father, who's been dead 10 months, is constantly in the news cycle because the president is so obsessed with the fact that he's never going to be a great man like he was. It's a bizarre way to grieve. It's a bizarre way to say goodbye to my dad.
Yep, it's all about her and her feelings. Like anyone really cares. In fact, the late, great Senator McCain may have cost his party control of the House of Representatives. Here's why. John McCain's single vote deep-sixed the repeal of Obamacare after he campaigned on repealing it and hours after he promised to vote for it. It was McCain's last public act, born of his legendary vengeful personality, and it handed the Democrats the health care issue, which landed atop the list of voter concerns and was therefore largely responsible for the Democrats' takeover of the House of Representatives. Yes, truth be told, if you don't like Democrats controlling the House and you don't like Obamacare, you can place the blame squarely on the late senator. Thank you again, Senator McCain, for your service. We'll return in a moment to discuss a rarity these days, an actual living, breathing, bipartisan initiative supported by the right wing and left wing alike.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
Truth
is making a
comeback.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, in the bitterly partisan political climate we find ourselves in, rare is the instance these days when you see conservatives, libertarians, and leftists working together on anything. Any worthwhile ideas on either side are seemingly viewed strictly in the political realm, which means if Trump or conservatives are for it, the left is automatically against it, and vice versa. So when there is a truly bipartisan initiative, it's worth standing up and taking notice. And such is the case with the Virginia Energy Reform Coalition, which seeks to end the monopoly grip of the massive energy utilities. In this case, 9 organizations representing almost the full range of ideologies from right to left across the public policy spectrum have found common cause in the need to reform Virginia's current regulation of monopoly electric utilities and open up competition in the energy market. And one of the lead members of the coalition is the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. And the president of VIPP, my old friend Lynn Taylor, joins us now. Hello, Lynn.
Hey, Tim. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. And Lynn, the headline in the Washington Post kind of says it all. Coalition of unlikely allies calls on state to break up utilities, deregulate energy. Now, VIPP is a free market institute. So I'm interested in how you approach the formation of a coalition ranging from your organization all the way over to the left-wing Virginia Poverty Law Center with people of opposite ideology. How'd you go about doing that?
Well, this was actually put together by the Earth Stewardship Alliance. And we're all basically wanting exactly the same thing. And that is for Virginians to have choice, to have opportunity in their electricity market. It's been done in other states and done successfully.
Well, the current system, according to Brennan Gilmore, executive director of one of the liberal groups in your coalition, Clean Virginia, says the system's built around a fundamental imbalance. What does he mean by that?
He means that there are so many opportunities now for other companies to come into the retail space in energy and electricity, much like Uber, if you will, came into the transportation space, much like Airbnbs came into the lodging space. I don't know of any other state that has put together this kind of coalition. This is, to tell you the truth, it's just unprecedented. That you have folks from across the ideological plane all wanting exactly the same thing. Pretty amazing. We would all like to see legislators less in bed, if you will, with the monopoly. So instead of taking their profits and putting them into, say, upgraded infrastructure, they put them into campaign donations.
Exactly. Now, let me pivot a little bit here to the political situation in Virginia. Since you and I moved here many years ago, Lynn, Virginia has changed more politically than any state in the Union, I would argue, from solid red to almost solid blue. The Democrats have won the state in the last 3 presidential elections. They have the governor's seat, both senators, 7 of the state's 11 congressional districts, after years of Republican dominance. How do you explain why and how Virginia turned blue?
I'm not so sure that there's a great deal of difference between the two political parties.
Uniparty,
They both are looking for, they're both looking for power. They're both looking for votes, and they want to get them in any way that they can.
Interesting. Now, I have to ask you this last question, because you're someone who's involved by necessity in Virginia politics. What are you hearing about the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general? 2 of them wore blackface, the 3rd accused of sexual assault by 2 women. Will those women accept the Republicans' invitation to testify before the state Senate? And what do you consider the state of play regarding Governor Ralph Northam?
I think that what happens when you try to judge things from a perspective that's in a different era under today's culture, I think that you're really doing a disservice.
Well, Lynn, I thank you for joining us and telling us about this truly bipartisan initiative, the Virginia Energy Reform Coalition. Good luck in advancing the ball down the field.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. We certainly appreciate you having us on the show.
Lynn Taylor, president of the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss Robert Mueller finally rearing his head.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, because
Truth
is making
a comeback.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So Robert Mueller, who remained out of public view during his 22-month-long special counsel investigation, decided to make his one and only public appearance this week, announcing that he's resigned now that his work is done and his office shuttered. Mueller had nothing really new to report, but before he left the stage, he sparked more calls for impeachment by contradicting Attorney General William Barr on the matter of whether Trump might have obstructed justice. Barr said previously that Mueller told him he wouldn't make a recommendation on obstruction, not just because of a Justice Department rule that a sitting president could not be indicted, but because he might have had insufficient evidence to recommend an indictment. But Mueller seemed to say the opposite.
If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. We did not, however, make a determination as to whether the president did commit a crime. Under long-standing department policy, a president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office. Charging the president with a crime was therefore not an option we could consider. And beyond department policy, we were guided by principles of fairness. It would be unfair to potentially accuse somebody of a crime when there can be no court resolution of the actual charge. So that was Justice Department policy. Those were the principles under which we operated, and from them we concluded that we would not reach a determination one way or the other about whether the president committed a crime.
So Mueller does the politically expedient thing, tossing an obstruction stink bomb into the middle of the room, watching everyone scurry around for cover, and then leaving the room for others to sort things out. Indeed, Mueller took no questions at his press conference and then announced he's done talking about his report.
I hope and expect this to be the only time that I will speak to you in this manner. I am making that decision myself. No one has told me whether I can or should testify or speak further about this matter. There has been discussion about an appearance before Congress. Any testimony from this office would not go beyond our report. I would not provide information beyond that which is already public in any appearance before Congress. I do not believe it is appropriate for me to speak further about the investigation or to comment on the actions of the Justice Department or Congress.
So Mueller says he's done, but while the Democrat-run House is unlikely to subpoena him, Mr. Mueller may soon find out that the Republican-run Senate is anxious for him to testify, perhaps on the matter of why Trump himself was never told about the supposed Russian infiltration of his campaign or the FBI investigation launched on his campaign, or why he chose so many rabidly partisan anti-Trump Democrats for his team of investigators, and perhaps about why he felt it appropriate to conduct military-style raids on Roger Stone and Paul Manafort that were reminiscent of the kind ordinarily seen in dictatorships. Now, Attorney General William Barr responded to Mueller's statement in an interview on CBS by saying Mueller had the ball in his court on the issue of obstruction, but decided to pass it.
I personally felt he could have reached a decision. He could have reached a conclusion. The opinion says you cannot indict a president while he's in office, but he could have reached a decision as to whether it was criminal activity. But he had his reasons for not doing it, which he explained. And I'm not going to, argue about those reasons. But when he didn't make a decision, the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, and I felt it was necessary for us as the heads of the department to reach that decision.
And of course, Mr. Barr has been called every name in the book since he and Rod Rosenstein made the decision. A Trump lackey, corrupt, political hack, all predictable from bloodthirsty, Trump-deranged Democrats led by party leader Nancy Pelosi invoking the C word and the dreaded I word.
In plain sight, in the public domain, this president is obstructing justice and he's engaged in a cover-up. And that could be an impeachable offense.
Right. An impeachable offense. Covering up a crime that never happened. How does that work? But when it comes right down to it, Pelosi later made a rather startling revelation couched in pleasant language, first expressing her outrage at Attorney General Barr, but then admitting she doesn't have anywhere near the votes for impeachment.
I am gravely disappointed in the Justice Department for their attitude, their misrepresentation of the Mueller report. Nothing is off the table. But we do want to make such a compelling case, such an ironclad case, that even the Republican Senate will be convinced of the path that we have to take as a country. I'm very proud of our House Democrats. They've been very, shall we say, conscientious about how they've reached their decisions, and maybe it's 38 of them out of 238 have said that they wanted to be outspoken on impeachment.
So there it is. A grand total of 38 out of 238 Democrats favoring impeachment. That's about 1/7 of Democrats in the House who actually want impeachment. But they're the ones that are making all the noise. Witness the radical left-wing freshman Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib appearing on MSNBC with Chris Matthews.
Only about 38 Democrats in the House, her caucus, are for acting on impeachment, and 200 are not. How do you see the numbers?
Well, for me, I've always looked at the numbers of the turnout that we saw in the last election. To me, it was a referendum. If you look at the numbers across this nation, it was very clear that many people came out because they wanted to elect a jury that would impeach this president.
Aha! There's the root of the problem for the socialist wing of the Democratic Party. They believe they won the House in the midterms because the voters want President Trump impeached, when in fact, the Democrats won because 40 Republican incumbents dropped out in a body where over 90% of incumbents get reelected, and because the voters somehow believe that the major midterm issue on the table, health care, would be better handled by Democrats, even though they were the ones who came up with the disaster known as Obamacare. Go figure. Now, I made the case earlier that if war hero John McCain had not broken both his campaign promise and his pledge to GOP leaders to vote for the Obamacare repeal, the midterm elections might have turned out very differently. Meanwhile, in the wake of these never-ending attempts to topple his presidency, and in keeping with his defiance of a flurry of congressional subpoenas, President Trump made the decision to finally unleash the dogs and permit the declassification of documents relating to Obama administration surveillance of Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, a decision that became pretty much unavoidable for the president. It's certainly possible that Democrats have refrained from impeachment because they know all too well that their actions in first attempting to prevent and then to cripple the Trump presidency could become a scandal of monstrous proportions. The Justice Department is conducting 3 investigations into it as we speak, and the findings will start coming out soon. And the Democrats know there could well be hell to pay for it. But for now, Pelosi and company seem to believe their best preemptive defense is an offense full of sound and fury up to, but not including, impeachment of Donald Trump. Trump's reactions from ordering that declassification to ignoring congressional subpoenas to walking out on that big infrastructure meeting with Pelosi and Chuck Schumer after Pelosi accused him of a crime right before the meeting signal that the 45th president is turning the tables and channeling old Clint Eastwood in his message to Pelosi and her ilk. We're done here. I dare you to impeach me. Go ahead. Make my day. quick break, and then we'll bring on LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza to analyze Robert Mueller's statement from the legal angle and tell you about two significant rulings this week from the Supreme Court.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And we welcome you back now to the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. It's when we are rejoined by our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. There's another title you can add on that, which is podcast manager or director or editor, which I have been elevated to at LibertyNation.com as well.
Does director trump editor, or does editor trump director?
Whichever the one is more prestigious is the one I wish to be referred to.
Whichever one has control over the other.
Yes,
is
exactly.
the actual answer. Right. All right, let's go into the legal side of Robert Mueller and what he said this week. Basically, Scott, he didn't say much that was terribly new, but held about a 10-minute press conference and told us in words what we had already read in writing. What was your takeaway from a legal standpoint of what Mueller said?
Yeah, the only two new things I saw, just for the record, were he's closing the office and quitting the Justice Department, and if he's called to testify before Congress, he will say nothing outside of the four corners of the document, it sounds like. And I heard nothing new beyond the four corners of the document. He just reiterated that the Justice Department guidelines prevented him from charging the president, and reiterated the statement about if they found out the president was innocent, they would have said so, basically.
Yeah.
Which I find very perplexing and confusing from a criminal justice perspective, Tim. Prosecutors should seek evidence of criminal wrongdoing. If they find that there's evidence beyond a reasonable doubt of that wrongdoing, they should bring charges. And other than that, they should stay quiet.
But Bill Barr had said previously that Mueller had told him that he wouldn't have made a recommendation even if that rule wasn't in place. So that is a difference. What he's saying here, it seems to me, is he's kicking it into the political realm by saying, well, the only reason that I didn't come up with a recommendation is because of this Justice Department rule. And that's different than what Barr said. That's a significant difference, is it not?
It is. I think it is a reading between the lines, and that's what I read between those lines as well, Tim.
Now, exoneration. Since when is it a special prosecutor's job to exonerate or not exonerate, or to comment on someone's innocence other than to say there's not sufficient evidence to bring charges against them?
Not only that, it's not appropriate for a prosecutor to be out there doing that, because what happens is Mueller cast some of his comments in the vein of, well, it wouldn't be fair to Donald Trump to go ahead and charge him because there's no mechanism for him to defend himself. Well, this is the same thing. There's no mechanism to defend yourself against a prosecutor who says, well, if I really thought he was innocent, I would say so.
Right.
But I'm not saying that.
Right.
I'm just saying I have nothing to charge him with. That's what's inappropriate about it, and it's an abuse of power, really.
Bob Mueller, veteran Washington insider, seemed very nervous during his press conference. He stumbled a lot. He seemed almost doddering to me. Did you pick that up as well?
I would have thought that the the special counsel and a man of his achievements and position would be better at a press conference than I would be. And I'm certain I could have done a way better job than he did. Now, maybe there was a technological reason why. Maybe he thought he'd have a prompter and didn't, or time to go over notes and he didn't. So there could be something like that. But yes, Tim, I agree 100%. I was very, very much surprised at his performance.
All right, let's talk Supreme Court. Couple of significant rulings, including one on the Indiana abortion law.
This was the law that Mike Pence signed before he became vice president, Tim. There were two provisions that the Supreme Court ruled on. One was that abortive fetus remains would be disposed of like any human death would be, basically cremation or burial. There were a series of stories about a medical waste company that was disposing of fetuses like it was like a cancerous tissue removed or something like that. It was outrageous to many of the citizens of Indiana who then passed this law. The second provision was that it made selecting an abortion because of the disability status of the unborn or their race, sex, other immutable characteristics. It said that was impermissible, and that physicians had to inform women that was the law. So the Supreme Court ruled that the burial provisions were valid. Now, here's the thing. That's not actually a win for the pro-life side. And the reason why is because Planned Parenthood, when they brought this case, chose a certain standard by which they wanted the court to examine it. And they said that it didn't meet the rational basis standard. And we've talked about these constitutional, these standards of judging whether a law meets its constitutional burden by the rights that it implicates. So if I say to you, you can't wear a blue shirt on a Tuesday, well, that's less of a fundamental right than you can't practice your religion, or you can't marry the person who you want to marry. And so those types of laws will be judged by a different standard. And so this law was judged by the rational basis standard because of Planned Parenthood's strategy in the litigation. And basically the Supreme Court said, well, it does meet the rational basis standard. Oh, and by the way, we expect it may not meet more heightened standards if you address that in the lower courts. And in fact, Justice Ginsburg wrote separately basically to say, hey, this is a waste of everybody's time, because we know that they're going to go re-argue the correct standard and they're going to come back and we're going to rule differently. And I expect that is in fact what will happen. The other part of the statute, Tim, that concerns the motivation for abortion had been stricken down by the lower courts and the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court let that decision stand.
Okay. The Supreme Court also limiting free speech retaliatory arrest claims. What's this about?
This is a bad decision, Tim, I think. And we talked about a case a few months ago by this man called Fane Lozman, and this sort of continues in that vein. And we can think about the case like this. If you are driving through town and you're a reporter who perhaps publishes things that the city fathers may not like, and you get pulled over for doing 26 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, and you go to court and you say, the only reason why I got this ticket for doing 26 is because of my publications.
But he did technically break the law,
right? That's exactly right, Tim. But the argument is I never would have been pulled over and wasn't pulled over, and it could be arrested, it could be whatever, because of the infraction, but it was because of the speech. And so the controversy came down and said, well, do you have to, in order to recover on a theory like that, so if you're the reporter and you sue the cops in the town, what do you have to prove in order to recover? Is it just that it was a retaliatory enforcement measure, or also that you weren't even breaking the law? And the sad thing is that, especially with vehicle stops, for instance, and other things, it's almost impossible not to break the law. And I think it needs to be said often that these left-wing justices oftentimes do not support individual rights when those rights clash with the state and government. They are big government liberals. They're not liberals who value individual rights and the power of the individual against the state. To that, we turn to the libertarianish members of the court, such as Gorsuch and Thomas.
Indeed, and the court also reflects the political realm in terms of leftists who basically have forgotten the individual in favor of the group, haven't they? Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Oh, by the way, did you hear the funny news is McConnell said that he's going to throw out his Supreme Court nominating role within a year of the election?
We'll find one.
Right.
Yeah, we'll find one. Yeah, you had to figure old Mitch had a couple things up his sleeve, and I, for one, was not surprised. I don't think anybody else was much either.
From Harry Reid's playbook.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with Mark Angelides, LibertyNation.com managing editor. Plus this radio show, as I mentioned, all available on demand, anytime, anywhere, on LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.